Not all battles are fought in war zones. Sometimes the most important ones happen on quiet street corners. They saw an old man feeding pigeons. What they didn't see was the warrior beneath the weathered exterior. Subscribe to the channel and follow along to see how this powerful story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. James Wilson had claimed this particular corner as his own for the better part of 15 years. Every Thursday afternoon, like clockwork, he would make his way down from his modest apartment, a paper bag of bird feed tucked carefully under his arm. At 72, his steps were slower than they once were, but they carried the same purposeful dignity that had marked his walk since his days in uniform. The corner itself wasn't much to look at. The intersection of Malcolm X Boulevard and 145th Street had seen better days, though signs of gentrification were creeping in like ivy up the old brick walls. New coffee shops stood alongside decades-old bodegas, an uneasy coexistence that mirrored the neighborhood's changing demographics. It was during one of these peaceful Thursday afternoons when James first noticed them. 3 young men, none older than 25, wearing clothes that cost more than his monthly pension. They moved with the artificial swagger of those who had never truly been tested, their confidence borrowed from music videos and social media posts. The leader, a tall youth wearing designer sneakers that had never seen real work, nudged his companions and pointed toward James. The old veteran continued feeding his pigeons, his hands moving with the measured precision that came from years of weapons training. Some skills he had learned never truly left you. "Yo, old-timer!" the tallest one called out, his voice carrying a false bravado that made James think of fresh lieutenants trying to sound authoritative. "This corner's under new management. Time for you to find somewhere else to feed your birds." James took his time responding, carefully folding the top of his paper bag before looking up. His eyes, sharp despite his age, took in each young man in turn. He saw their expensive clothes, their practiced poses, and beneath it all, their uncertainty. "You know," James said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years, "in 1968 outside of Kaisan, I learned something important about fear and courage." He stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. "I learned that real strength doesn't need to announce itself." The transformation happened in the space of a heartbeat, yet seemed to stretch time like a rubber band pulled taut. In that crystalline moment, the artificial bravado of youth collided with the weathered reality of experience, and the result was as inevitable as gravity. James Wilson's quiet stance spoke volumes, his body language conveying decades of discipline that no amount of street posturing could match. It began with his eyes. Those who had served in combat zones developed a particular kind of gaze, steady, evaluating, yet somehow distant, as if perpetually focused on a horizon that civilians couldn't quite see. James's eyes held that quality now, dark brown irises that had witnessed humanity at both its worst and its finest. They moved from one young man to another with deliberate precision, not challenging, not threatening, but simply seeing them for who they truly were. Boys playing at being men, wearing aggression like ill-fitting clothes. The shift in their demeanor started subtly. The tallest one, who had been so vocal moments before, unconsciously adjusted his stance, his weight shifting from the balls of his feet back to his heels. It was the instinctive response of someone who had been preparing for confrontation, suddenly realizing that aggression wasn't the answer. His designer sneakers, pristine white against the grimy sidewalk, seemed to lose their significance as status symbols under James's measured gaze. The military bearing that James carried wasn't something he put on like a costume. It had been etched into his very being through months of training and years of service. His shoulders remained squared, his spine straight despite his age, each movement economical and purposeful. This wasn't the exaggerated posturing of street toughs. This was the genuine article, the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. As James spoke of Kaisan, his voice carried the weight of authentic experience. There was no need for volume or dramatic emphasis. The truth in his words was evident in their quiet delivery. The mention of that battle, just 2 simple words, Kaisan, hung in the air like smoke, carrying with it the unspoken weight of history that these young men had only encountered in movies or video games. The second youth, who had been flanking his taller friend, was the first to physically back down. His shoulders hunched slightly, hands unclenching from the fists they'd unconsciously formed. There was something in James's presence that spoke to a deeper part of him, perhaps reminding him of a grandfather or uncle who carried similar invisible badges of honor. The gold chain around his neck suddenly felt heavy, like it was weighing him down rather than lifting him up. The third member of their group, who had been maintaining his tough facade through sheer determination, found his mask cracking. His eyes darted between James and his friends, reading the changing dynamics with the sharp instinct for survival that street life had taught him. But this situation didn't fit any of his usual patterns. There was no threat to counter, no disrespect to answer, just the steady presence of a man who had faced far worse than 3 young posturers on a city corner. James's words about brotherhood and survival in the jungle cut through their defenses like a hot knife through butter. When he spoke of how race disappeared in the face of survival, how the color of a man's skin meant nothing when he was watching your back in a firefight, it resonated with an authenticity that no street philosophy could match. These young men, who had built their identities around their toughness, their ability to intimidate, found themselves confronting a different kind of strength altogether. The pigeons continued their peaceful pecking around James's feet, undisturbed by the tension in the air. Their presence somehow emphasized the absurdity of the situation. Here was a man who spent his Thursday afternoons feeding birds, yet he commanded more genuine respect than any of their carefully cultivated swagger could generate. The birds' indifference to the human drama playing out around them served as a quiet reminder of how unnecessary the confrontation had been from the start. The transformation in the young men's body language told its own story. Their carefully maintained expressions of toughness began to slip, revealing glimpses of the uncertainty beneath. It wasn't fear that caused this change. James had generated no threat, made no aggressive moves. Rather, it was recognition. Recognition of authentic strength, recognition of genuine experience, recognition of the vast gulf between their performed toughness and the real thing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, highlighting the contrast between James's seated position and their standing poses. Despite being physically lower, James held the higher ground in every way that mattered. His calm demeanor and steady gaze made their aggressive stances seem not just unnecessary, but almost childish in comparison. The street noise continued around them, cars honking, distant sirens, the general symphony of city life. But in their immediate vicinity, a different kind of silence had fallen. It was the silence of recognition, of reassessment, of young men facing a mirror that showed them not as they imagined themselves to be, but as they truly were. Their expensive clothes and practiced intimidation techniques suddenly seemed like costume pieces in the presence of a man who had faced real battles and emerged carrying real strength. As James continued speaking, his words about Khe-san and the true meaning of courage began to bridge the generational gap that had seemed so vast just moments before. The young men found themselves drawn in, not by fear or force, but by the authentic power of lived experience. Their defensive postures gradually relaxed, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of something they had been unknowingly searching for, a genuine example of the strength they had been trying so hard to imitate. In those few minutes on a city corner, surrounded by cooing pigeons and the fading afternoon light, 3 young men received an education that no street could provide. They learned that real power doesn't need to shout, that true strength often speaks in whispers, and that sometimes the greatest show of courage is in knowing when to set aside the mask of toughness and simply listen to the wisdom that experience brings. The moment hung in the air like mist over morning waters, as Drake, the tallest of the 3 young men, felt the carefully constructed walls of his street persona begin to crumble. His confession about his grandfather emerged not from his practiced tough guy voice, but from somewhere deeper, younger, more authentic. The words seemed to surprise even him as they fell from his lips. My grandfather, he was in Vietnam too, never talked about it much. In that simple statement lay years of unspoken questions, of family dinners where his grandfather would grow quiet at certain topics, of old photographs in military uniform that gathered dust in family albums. Drake had always sensed there was something more behind his grandfather's silence, but he'd been too caught up in his own carefully crafted image to really understand. Until now, facing James, he began to recognize the same quiet strength he'd occasionally glimpsed in his grandfather's eyes. James absorbed Drake's words with the patience of a man who had heard similar stories many times before. He understood the weight of silence that Vietnam veterans often carried, the stories left untold, the memories too heavy to share with family. His hand moved slowly to his coat pocket, pulling out an old, worn wallet. From it, he extracted a faded photograph, handling it with the reverence one might show a sacred text. The other two young men, Marcus and Chris, found themselves drawn closer, their earlier aggression forgotten in the face of this unexpected turn of events. The street corner that had moments ago been a territory to defend had transformed into a space of shared history. The autumn breeze carried the soft flutter of pigeon wings and distant city sounds, creating an almost sacred atmosphere around their small group. Your grandfather, James spoke softly, would have understood something that took me years to learn. The real battle isn't out there on the streets. It's not about who controls what corner or who looks the toughest. He gestured to his heart. The real battle is in here. It's about finding the strength to be who you really are, not who you think others expect you to be. The words resonated differently with each young man. For Drake, they connected with memories of his grandfather's quiet dignity. For Marcus, they spoke to the exhaustion of maintaining his tough facade. For Chris, they touched something he'd been running from, the vulnerability of being genuine in a world that seemed to demand constant posturing. James's offer to share his stories came with no judgment, no lecture about their previous behavior. Instead, it carried the simple wisdom of a man who had lived through enough to know that understanding often comes through sharing, through the bridge of stories passed from one generation to another. The bench beside him, weathered and worn like the man himself, seemed to represent more than just a place to sit. It became a symbol of transition, a space where masks could be set aside. The young men's decision to sit down marked more than just a physical change in position. It represented a choice to listen, to learn, to connect with something deeper than their street personas had allowed. As they settled onto the bench, their designer clothes and expensive sneakers seemed less like armor and more like the costumes they really were. Drake found himself sitting closest to James, unconsciously mimicking the older man's posture. His questions, when they came, weren't about combat or violence, the things young men usually wanted to know about war. Instead, he asked about his grandfather's generation, about the bonds formed between soldiers, about how they carried their experiences back into civilian life. James's responses painted pictures of humanity in its most complex forms, tales of brotherhood that transcended racial boundaries, of courage that had nothing to do with swagger, of strength that showed itself most clearly in moments of gentleness. His words carried the weight of lived experience, each story a carefully chosen thread in a larger tapestry of understanding. As the conversation deepened, the young men began sharing pieces of their own stories. Marcus spoke of the pressure to appear tough in their neighborhood. Chris admitted his fears about showing weakness, and Drake revealed his struggles to understand his family's legacy. What had begun as a confrontation transformed into a moment of genuine connection, bridging not just generations, but different ways of seeing the world. The pigeons continued their peaceful routine around them, occasionally pecking at the feed James would scatter. Their presence served as a gentle reminder of the ritual that had brought them all together, a simple act of kindness, feeding birds on a Thursday afternoon. In this moment, the corner belonged to no one and everyone, a shared space where understanding could grow and wisdom could be passed from one generation to the next. This understanding wasn't just about Vietnam or war stories, it was about recognizing authentic strength, about seeing past the superficial marks of power to something more fundamental. It was about young men learning that their worth didn't depend on their ability to intimidate, and an older man sharing the kind of wisdom that can only come from having lived through both the worst and best of what life can offer. As the day's light began its slow descent into evening, the transformation that had taken place on that humble street corner was nothing short of remarkable. The space that had begun as contested territory had evolved into something sacred, a place of storytelling, understanding, and unexpected connection. The four men sat together, their earlier confrontation now feeling like a distant memory from another lifetime. James's stories flowed with the natural rhythm of a master storyteller, each tale carefully chosen to convey lessons learned in the crucible of war, but applicable to the streets these young men knew. He spoke of loyalty that went beyond skin color or background, of courage that manifested not in violence, but in standing up for what was right, and of strength that showed itself most profoundly in moments of peace rather than conflict. Drake, who had initiated the original confrontation, now sat with his elbows on his knees, completely engrossed. His designer jacket, which had earlier served as a symbol of his street status, was now casually draped over the bench's back. The change in his demeanor was striking. Gone was the artificial swagger, replaced by the genuine engagement of a young man discovering his connection to a legacy larger than himself. His questions about his grandfather's service came more frequently now, each answer helping him piece together a puzzle he hadn't even known he was trying to solve. Marcus and Chris, too, had undergone their own transformations. Marcus had pulled out his phone not to record or intimidate, as might have happened hours earlier, but to show James pictures of his own family. His uncle, it turned out, had served in Desert Storm, and suddenly connections were being forged across generations and conflicts. Chris, the quietest of the three, listened with an intensity that spoke of someone finally finding answers to questions they'd never known how to ask. The pigeons, constant witnesses to this metamorphosis, continued their peaceful gathering around the bench. James would occasionally pause in his storytelling to scatter more feed, the simple act now carrying the weight of ritual. The bird's presence served as a reminder of the consistency and peace that had drawn James to this corner in the first place, a peace that was now being shared and multiplied. As the afternoon wore on, other residents of the neighborhood passed by, doing double takes at the sight of these unlikely companions. The corner, once known as a spot of potential tension, had been transformed into a place of intergenerational dialogue. Some neighbors nodded in approval, sensing the significance of what they were witnessing, a bridge being built between the old and the young, the past and the present. The stories James shared weren't all about war. He wove in tales of returning home, of fighting different kinds of battles, against prejudice, against systemic barriers, against the temptation to let bitterness take root. These were stories that resonated deeply with his young audience, who faced their own versions of these struggles on the city streets. The parallel between their experiences, though separated by decades, became increasingly clear. As evening approached, the young men made no move to leave. Instead, they helped James gather his belongings when he mentioned the cooling air. Their movements were different now. Gone was the aggressive posturing, replaced by the natural respect of those who had gained understanding. They assisted not out of obligation, but out of genuine concern for the man who had given them something far more valuable than control of a corner. The resolution of that Thursday afternoon extended far beyond that single day. In the weeks that followed, the corner became a regular meeting place, not just for James and his pigeons, but for a growing group of young people who came to hear stories, seek guidance, or simply share in the peace that seemed to emanate from that spot. The young men who had arrived as would-be intimidators became unofficial guardians of the corner, ensuring that James could continue his Thursday ritual undisturbed. Drake, in particular, began bringing others to listen to James's stories. He had started recording them too, not for social media or street cred, but to preserve them, understanding their value as bridges between generations. The corner became known in the neighborhood not as a territory to be claimed, but as a place where wisdom was shared and respect was given freely. The transformation extended into their daily lives. The young men began carrying themselves differently, their strength now coming from understanding rather than intimidation. They started seeing their neighborhood not as a battleground for respect, but as a community that could benefit from the kind of wisdom James had shared with them. James, for his part, found renewed purpose in these Thursday gatherings. The corner that had been his quiet refuge now buzzed with the energy of youth seeking understanding, of stories being passed down, of lessons being learned not through confrontation, but through connection. His pigeons now had many feeders, each young visitor taking turns to scatter seeds while listening to tales of courage, brotherhood, and the true meaning of strength. The resolution wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. It marked the start of a new tradition, where the wisdom of age met the energy of youth, where stories bridged generations, and where a simple street corner became a sanctuary of understanding in an often misunderstood world.